Well, we kept it brief purposely to have time to make this very interactive, and we've got a good crowd here. So I hope you won't be shy and not just ask questions, but just plain questions with simple answers, but ask questions that will elicit discussion and make this as interactive as possible. I was taking a few notes and during the two presentations, and I just read back some of the things that I noted down here. First one had to do with software or component bill of materials. Just an observation, this is something that, again, speaking in my capacity as the Standards Committee co-chair, we've been asked to add substantial content to the 62443 standards about this, and frankly, we're struggling with what exactly is needed in an international standard talking about supply chain and S-bombs and C-bombs. Because keeping in mind, international standards are not prescriptive. They do define what you have to do, but not necessarily how you have to do it. So if anyone here has some thoughts on that, we'd love to hear your thoughts and get your thoughts into the committee thinking process, because that's as was pointed out here today by Michael, this is a very complicated, far-reaching subject. Another point that Michael made was, even if you had that information, would you know what to do with it? You can imagine, depending on how deep you drill down into that component analysis, you could get a tremendous amount of information, because we know nowadays that software, I only speak about software for a moment, is incredibly complex. And the other thing that doesn't add or does not help mitigate the problem is that the practice that a lot of software developers have had in the past and probably still do is, oh, I need this particular module or this particular object, I'll use that term, out of an object library, so I just import the whole library. So I've got basically a bunch of dead code dead in the sense that I don't need it active in my software, but I just imported the whole library and there it is. Now I've heard horror stories about that. I've heard from people that, for example, there are still people out there that like to write their software in assembler and start it from scratch. And they're the ones that can come up with an application that's 14K instead of 3 megabytes because they don't import all that stuff. I don't know how true that is in today's world, because I long ago gave up any credible claim to being a software developer, although I was way back early in my career. So anyway, this whole connection and the complexity of this aspect of the supply chain. Who is responsible was the other question I wrote down. Who's responsible? And the other word I'd add is accountable, because they're not necessarily the same thing. Who's responsible and who's accountable for dealing with this complexity on the supply chain and maybe I'd use the term genealogy of the products that you're using. So moving on to Clint's remarks, I wrote down, this was sort of tongue-in-cheek, he talked about insider threats and either advertent or inadvertent, and for the advertent ones, from perhaps a current or former disgruntled employee. And I wrote down was, what we want all of our people to be thoroughly gruntled, okay? We don't want them disgruntled, we want them thoroughly gruntled so that they don't get upset. But the integrity of the data, I never thought about this one, about the integrity of the data. Somebody grabs your data, adds something to it, compromises it, encrypts it, and then you decrypt it and get it back, and you have no chain of evidence. You have no continuity to know what's in that data. So every time I talk to somebody or hear from somebody like Clint, who's got a lot more experience in this space than I get more and more afraid. More, be afraid, be very afraid. The help desk one really tweaked with me too, because think about it. I've managed groups that ran help desks in my history, and what are they measured on? They have performance metrics that they have to meet. Number of cases dealt with and mean time to restore service. Does that give them much time to do any kind of analysis or follow-up? No. So that's why the first line in every every service, like if you have a cable TV system or whatever, the very first thing is unplug the equipment, plug it back in again. Because if that's going to solve the problem, then on to the next client, okay? And then the other one that I hadn't thought about, but it's obvious when you think about it, is cloud-based data. And I can understand that if you've got something in, Amazon service or AWS or any of those services, then it may be your data, but whether or not you have access to it for purposes like forensics, unless it's spelled out in a contract. And how many people here always read the fine print on those long end user agreements, right? That they print out on, on 4-point type. It's, I don't care too much about my personal data because, there's nothing there that's probably too terribly sensitive. But for a company, that's a very important point. So anyway, those are just some of my takeaways, and you probably have some of your own. And we've got, I think, about half of our allotted time. So we've got about an hour, lots of time for some questions and discussion. And you've got an opportunity here for some expert feedback. And by the way, I didn't want to skip over our panelists. We chose panelists as well because of their end user asset owner perspective. And so they think of them as your cohorts or people that if you're an asset owner, that you share some of the same challenges with. And to the extent that they're willing to share, that have them do that. So we have our first question from over here.
Yeah. Good afternoon, Jonathan Tubb with Siemens Energy. So, we're on the vendor side. I get questions from my customers every day about information from us for supply chain risk and management. And one of the first questions I always have back to my customers is, okay, what are your data protection policies? Because my concern is, as I'm sharing things that are part of inherently our secure development lifecycle and indicators of, components of our system, I've basically done the homework for weaponizing our equipment. So, if one customer doesn't have sufficient protections on that information and it gets compromised, suddenly all my customers have a problem. How do we generally as an industry kind of solve that problem? I know there's some moves to do some software clearinghouses, right? Government managed risk analysis of products, but I don't see a clear answer to solving that. I'm curious what your guys' thoughts are.
Who wants to take that? Don't all speak at once.
Everybody's heard me talk already, so.
Yeah.
Glenn looks like he's got some thoughts.
Well, as I told Eric when he asked for volunteers, if you want somebody that's an expert on the topic, don't look at me. But if you want somebody that'll give his opinion, I'm glad to give my opinion. That's a very challenging situation because we as a customer need to know how that's going to impact us. And you as a supplier need to know that your information you're sharing is protected. I don't have an answer, but I am in agreement with you that it is a tremendous challenge because we need to know from I focus more on architectural design considerations. And how does that vulnerability in your software expose me? If it doesn't expose me to any additional risk, I don't need to know any more than it doesn't expose you to additional risk, in my opinion. So we need some way of identifying or determining whether that particular situation, vulnerability, compromise, whatever it is going to increase the risk to me as an organization. If it doesn't, I don't need to know anymore. I just need to know red, yellow, green type of thing. This does or does not impact the risk to your organization. Now, that's kind of difficult for you as a supplier because you have a component that may be used in, a wastewater treatment facility, or it may be used in a, baby food manufacturing. You don't know how that is implemented. You don't know how their architecture is set up to protect the assets that you created. So that's a tremendous challenge, but we need to know, how it impacts it. Now, the CVSS scoring is kind of a bit of a way to go to say, okay, it's exposed by the network, so it may increase your risk. mean, something like that, some type of scoring system may help with that.
Yeah, I was going to also just comment on the network architecture and really understanding that environment so that you can assess what the risk might be. And also maybe a vendor scorecard when it comes to cyber conditions and how it's applied in the environment. I mean, those are some of the things that can be looked at from a vendor perspective.
I was going to suggest, definitely ask yourself what data needs to be shared with those, different vendors, right? You don't necessarily always have to share the data, Clint's name, right, or somebody's name, but you could get, it could be your own internal code for who that vendor is. So if that gets compromised in the cloud or wherever, they don't actually have who that individual or those people are. They might have the data, but it's going to be a little harder to kind of try to piece it together on whose it is. But definitely asking yourself, I think, what data needs to be shared and what, kind of making note of that using a scorecard or something.
The problem that you run into is how many of your customers actually use your product the way that you intended it to be used? And then how many, it's not that whether your product is secure and the product next to it is secure, it's how do they combine together? You might have put armor plating around yours, they put armor plating around theirs, but sometimes you've got to do something to make those two things communicate in the first place. And then where do those handoffs occur? Because the threat actors are always going to find that chink in the armor. And you're right, it's about speed to how you can communicate when there's something going wrong out there. But then the question comes back to how long do you get to do that? If you have a product that you put out 15 years ago that you called end of life, but there's still hospitals using it because they can't afford to move to the next one, but it's your brand that's on there. So guess what the public, when the media reports that, the hospital was breached, they're going to say it's because of a Siemens appliance, or, company XYZ's appliance. How long are you on the hook then for that? How long are you supposed to be putting out these scorecards to say, is my, product compliant, not compliant? Keep putting out patches. Who actually owns the responsibility? And I think that's what the courts haven't decided that in the 20-something years I've been. They don't know whether the person who bought the product or the person who developed the product or somebody in between the resellers, who's responsible for security? And the quick answer is we all are. But the problem is when something happens, the finger pointing starts instead of the help starting. And until we overcome that hurdle of how do we help each other and stop pointing fingers at each other, I think we're always going to have this problem. And because when you start to put out red, yellow, green, I think even some sort of scorecard, that gives people a false sense of security. The security theater comes to mind. It's like, well, that was a green product. Yeah, but you're using it in a way we didn't intend to use it, hooking it up to things that we didn't know it was going to be hooked up to. You got to go off of more than just what I said it was green. You need to look at how you have it implemented, whether it's green or not. So
the way each of you answered is kind of very telling, right? We're all looking at risk, ownership, and vulnerability, right? And the questions that I'm getting from my customers is information to inform those decisions, a software bill of material, ensuring delivery in our supply chain, whether that's electronically or physically, right? All the things that would allow our customers to make a risk decision on their own. But inherently, that information is what makes our secure processes secure. So the ownership and risk goes both ways. As I'm sharing that information with my customers, if that is compromised, it also introduces a security risk for all my customers. So the real question is, how do we manage that information and share it in a meaningful way to inform your risk decisions while not, adding additional risk in general? Right? Because, and again, an attacker, right? If I'm the bad guy and I can go to a database and find a software bill of material for every major vendor that you're using, I mean, holy cow, right? I'd be drooling, right? I'm like, all right, I know every vulnerability that I need to scan for, right? Every version of OpenSSL that I can crack right off the bat because you're using a 10-year-old, embedded product. So as we're developing these international standards, right? My products are IEC 62443, 3-3, and 4-1 certified, but what does that really mean? And what does that mean to you? And I think that's what I'm trying to get to.
And Log4j really points that out. I mean, how many of you have looked at the list recently? Every day there's new vendors that are coming forward finally now, and it's been, what, how long? And there's new vendors every day saying, oh yeah, by the way, we're using Log4j, you know, and every day. I mean, it's somebody new, because some of these vendors didn't even know that they were using Log4j because it was so far buried in their supply chain. They didn't know that the chip that they got from this vendor that they put in with this firmware onto this board, with this board went into this part of the appliance, which went into this. That's where the real vulnerability came from, you know. So it's very difficult. That's a great question, and I don't think that's one that we're going to be able to solve anytime soon. I know that what the big federal government would say is, well, because we don't want to be that clearinghouse. We don't want to be the holder of that information, because guess who gets attacked more than anybody in the world is us, you know. You know, if OPM is any, you know, indication.
You know, this is neither, well, it's not, we know it's not a simple question or a simple problem. It's also not new or unique, because when you think of beyond the range of security, in my experience in the chemical industry, we used to have a term, and I think it's probably still a current term, called product stewardship. That you have responsibility, you have stewardship responsibility over the products that you sell and deliver to the customer. And in my case, chemicals, right? Use chemicals. We used to make, my former employer made a lot of hazardous chemicals, and we used to basically audit our customers and fire customers who didn't use the chemicals properly, because it's irresponsible. So you don't, you know, if you have a customer that persistently doesn't take care of a tank car of ethylene oxide and leaves it out in the sun, God forbid, or doesn't handle chlorine properly or whatever, then, you know, you don't do business with them anymore. I don't know if anyone has done that in the case of security, but the concept is the same, and it's a huge problem. But I think we are at the cusp of the problem now, which is awareness, and Log4j is a good example of that. People are now becoming aware of just exactly what's buried or could be buried out there.
Yeah, Eric, just a quick comment. Sometimes we allow incidents to drive behavior.
Yeah.
And so a lot of times we don't look at things until something really happens, and it forces us into a situation where we really have to take a look at, you know, how are we managing work in this space, if it's lifecycle management or even our playbooks or anything of those nature. I mean, those are things that kind of drive that behavior towards what we need to do to prepare for ransomware attacks.
So I think a good part is, I don't even know if this is working.
It'll come on, keep talking, it'll come on.
So I think one of the important things is the trust between the vendor and the end user. Because really what they're looking for from you is an understanding about like the core function of asset management. Do I know what I have inside my environment? And the SBOM is that everybody's clamoring for right now is what's going to get them that information to make that decision. So a way to foster trust between those two organizations, like Log4j was a really good example. People didn't realize that they had it. So now they want to know, I need to know what's in here because I am the ultimate owner of risk. Like, yes, Siemens, GE, Yokogawa, whoever made the thing, I'm the one that uses it that holds the operational risk. So instilling trust between those two orgs and finding a way to do that without, and I share your concern as a working for component vendors and a component vendor ourselves. Like, how far, like, do you need the hardware blocks on the silicon that we gave you? Because this is like the keys to the kingdom of all the things. And then giving that out to every single customer that you service. So it's a really tough answer. Like, okay, we'll give this to you, but what are you going to use it for and how are you going to secure it? And often those answers are not trustworthy on their end either. So a way that we can kind of come together and give the end users the ability to make informed decisions and become responsive and aware if some new attack comes out, which is inevitable. But also kind of protect your interests as a vendor is where we need to meet in the middle. It's going to take communication in order to do that and kind of evolution of the standard.
Well, you know, here's a thought, and this just popped into my head. I can remember times when we purchased software from companies that, well, let's just say that they were not startups, but they were relatively new companies. And their long-term viability was a factor in doing business with them. So what we did was we wrote a clause into the contract that you have to put your source code in escrow. We don't want a copy of your source code, but you have to put it in trusted escrow with a third party. so that if you disappear tomorrow, we can get access to it. Maybe, I don't know, maybe S-bombs could be put into escrow such that they can only be released under the terms of a discovery as part of a, now obviously that's locking the door after the horse is out of the barn. But at the end of the day, we're in a litigious society, and the people that are going to be accountable, I agree that ultimately it's the asset owner, the end user, that's accountable for the consequence element of risk. But from a legal perspective, it's basically who gets the first discovery notice and who's got the deepest pockets.
He does. Hi, Eric.
Hi.
Jay Manisheri, Fluence Analytics. I think a very good point was raised here. Now, the escrow, I'm a supplier. So the question is, collaborate, give the data. But a lot of time, as you mentioned, you give it all the way to the chip level design. Can the end user even do anything with that
Right.
data? So I think part of the answer maybe should be to a certain level that the end user can use that data be given, and then the balance of that data to be in some sort of escrow. Should an event happen, then that's accessible.
That's an interesting
It's
idea
a
too.
hybrid solution.
Yeah.
Yeah, just wanted
Yeah,
to throw it
no,
out there.
that's worth considering.
Yeah, so one of the things that we do when we are reviewing vulnerabilities, we have weekly meetings to review OT relevant vulnerabilities, and one of the stipulations that we put into the end user communications is if you are doing these things, you're following our architectural design, you're doing the things that we have in our policies and guidelines, then the threat to you is limited. And back to your factor, if you're using my product the way that it is described in this document and how the protections around it should be implemented, then the threat to you does not change by this particular vulnerability that's been, that type of communication, I think, from an end user, for me, that would be acceptable. I can't speak for all end users, but that's all I'm looking for is does this change, my threats or the risk to me? And if you had a document saying, it really aligns with what you're saying there. If you're using it the way that I have this designed in this document, then your risk doesn't change.
Any other thoughts on this point? Yeah.
Actually, I guess what I'm really wanting to ask is, shouldn't this make the use case for 62443 even more compelling, right? It helps isolate you from some of this risk because you might have embedded risk, but you're not exposed. And I just curious what the thoughts are on the architecture model. And should, we talked earlier in the earlier sessions, people are saying, well, we want to migrate away from that, from the convenience of cloudification and other things. And we're chasing cost all the time.
Don't get me started on that one.
But this risk situation seems to drive the 62443, make it more important. I don't know what the panel thinks about that.
I know that's a toss-up to me, so I'm gonna let somebody else answer it before I come back.
Well, I can, let me make a quick, I feel compelled to say something since I chair the committee. 62443 does try to address a lot of this. As somebody mentioned earlier, we have a standard in the series around secure development lifecycle, 4-1. And we also have one around, actually two, one around system level requirements and one around component level requirements. So, we've tried to address it as much as we can within a normative standard. Not to say that there can't be more work done. But one thing that we have learned is in this area and in many areas, security is a lot like safety. In that when you talk about the process safety world or safety in general, people get their safety system certified. What you're certifying is in situ. The system can be certified when it's installed and running. The product that's used to make the system is safety capable, but it depends on how it's implemented. So what we try in a committee to get people to understand is that there's no such thing as a secure product. There's a securable product, but to have it absolutely unqualified declaration of being secure, it's like a colleague of mine used to say, you can't make something foolproof because fools are too ingenious. So I think that that's something that everybody has to embrace that and understand that it is shared between the supplier and the end user. I
So,
see at least one head nodding, so I think
So-
at least one person agrees with.
yeah, you mentioned in your opening presentation, nation state defense, and if a nation state is set their sights on you, there's nothing you can do about it. And I like to quote Rob Lee. Most of you guys know Rob Lee from he's a SANS instructor, and his verbiage is be exceptional at the basics. And the ISA 95 layered architecture that is ingrained in the IEC 62443 is part of the basics. When you start looking at what new bell or whistle or data stream you need, ask yourself, do you need data or do you need connectivity? That's where we always push back on. You have these people that say, oh, we need connectivity, we need connectivity, but most of the time, they just need some data so that they can make an informed decision about something. So when you have a vendor that builds a product that's designed to be protected in a certain way, and then you start putting these IIoT devices on that are talking directly to the cloud, provides an access ingress into that environment for that system that should be protected, it exposes additional risk to you as an organization. So the question has to be, does the value that this gizmo add compensate for the risk it introduces? And I don't think many organizations really factor that in. They get some vendor that has a nice little product that they want to say, we'll try this out. And I think you talked about, they connected the time clock system. Nice vendor comes in with a time clock that you can connect to the internet. And now you've exposed your manufacturing environment to a risk that didn't exist before. So be cautious of that and look at it. I'm still a firm believer that architectural design and using, good practices in architectural design will reduce the likelihood of even a state-sponsored threat actor from having their way with your environment. It won't completely eliminate it, but it will reduce it.
Any other questions, either on a different topic or Sid? I think it'll start when you start talking.
Is it on? Oh, okay. Can you hear me? No. Everybody's made me feel so good this afternoon, all the nice comments about supply chain and ransomware. I'm just about ready to give up. But I want to just shift to the ransomware. I mean, the supply chain to me, and I'm familiar, supply chain in the sense of software supply chain. I understand logistics supply chains and that, so I'm talking about the software supply chain issue. But anyhow, that just sounds incredibly difficult to solve. I mean, everybody talks about SBOMs, and then listening, it's so obvious that what do you do with all that information? It sounds nice, but is it really useful? Can you really solve the problem? So I think that's very challenging. I want to shift back to the ransomware, though, because one thing that people talk a lot about is the backups. Now, I understand what Clint said, that how do you know that? Well, that was more than data that you get recovered. But from the point of view of backups, I mean, in backups, if you have a good backup policy, you would think, okay, they're not, even if they get in and they stick something in it before they encrypt it, and then you just unencrypt it or whatever, decrypt it, whichever term you want to use. I understand that. I get that. And it's very sneaky. And that's one thing I'm personally afraid of all the time. I know these people are way too smart for me. There's no way you could ever consider all the things that somebody else can do to you. It's a hard game to play. But just the basis of backups. I mean, is backup policies, if you find people that really have a good backup policy, and I don't know what that would mean, it probably would vary by the business and everything. Is that a reasonable protection? It's kind of like, when I was talking about the active and passive defensive stuff, I think everybody accepts today that it doesn't matter what kind of defenses you put in place, there's still a chance someone will find a way through it. So you have to put in a detection and response plan to be able to deal with that, to find, when you do get hit, then you have to focus on reducing the impact. And I think that the backup is kind of a similar issue, and I'm just wondering, but maybe not. I mean, if you go in and the backups they have are 2 months old, then it doesn't work, right? But I'm just, what's your opinion about backups as a solution to the ransomware issue?
Yes. I do know that one of the areas that our insurance carriers are asking questions about is around backups. That's one of the areas that definitely is of high importance. If you think about the entire spectrum of what's required for ransomware, I look at it as a CPR, like a CPR. We use acronyms for everything. So if we think about the communication and the preparedness and, what do you need to do to restart your own operations, those are elements that are required in order for us to look at how can we reduce that impact of a ransomware type of situation. And the preparedness piece really deals with backups, but not just backing up, recovery of it. Are we testing it? Because it's one thing to document these things and to get things backed up and say we're all set. But if you've never tested the recovery aspect of it, I think we could be setting ourselves up for a failure there. And then the other area, of course, is what we've heard already before, is the immutable backup. That's something that definitely having that encryption in place and trying to do as much as we can to make sure that we're prepared from that aspect. So I think that those are key elements.
Yeah, I want to jump in on that and say that, backup strategy has to be unique to your organization, and I can't stress that enough. It has to fit your operational model. And one of the case studies I didn't talk about when I was up there was an organization that got hit. Everybody always concerns themselves, and you probably have this in your own environment. You have recovery time objective, right? How fast can you recover? Has anybody ever looked at recovery point objective for your organization? At what point is the data no longer relevant? So we had an organization that got hit at 5 o'clock on a Wednesday with ransomware. Now, for most people, you're like, okay, it's 5 o'clock on a Wednesday. And we talked to this company, we were trying to help them, and they said, okay, what's your backup strategy? We do nightly backups. All right, so you're only going to lose today's data. And they're like, you don't understand that we can't lose today's data because today is the day, this was a courthouse, and it's like today is the day that all of our fines get paid, all of our prisoners get transferred, all of our court cases happen on Wednesdays. We can't lose today's data because then we won't know which prisoners are where, things like that. We've had hospitals get hit. Once again, they were doing hourly backups, but the difference that an hour makes in a patient, whether they've received medication, not received medication, what they're allergic to, this can all happen within minutes, So does your backup strategy actually meet your operational environment? And even then, what is the bad guy using your backup strategy for? Because one of the first things the threat actors are going to do is look for your backups, and they're going to try and encrypt your backups before they hit anything else. Your backups in your Active Directory, that's what they go after. But what if they're just storing, time bombs or their security tools in your backup? So every time you restore, you're putting their back doors right back into your environment. Because like I said, the average threat actor is in your environment for 45 days before they detonate. How much could they, so you're saying, oh, well, our backups go back a week. Okay, well, do they go back 45 days? And are they any good if you go back 45 days so that you're not just keep restoring the ransomware to keep detonating itself? How are you validating the data that you're backing up? And then, like you said, does it actually, if you restore it, but you're not, if you only have part of it because you didn't think about the system, you designed your backup around the way the system operated 5 years ago versus the way the system operates now. And then how are you looking at the cloud services and stuff like that as well? So backups it's a key element in how you recover from ransomware, but your strategy has to fit your operational environment.
Another point you made that I just want to feed back just to make sure I got it is even if you say you back up, say your operation, if you backed up every hour, you needed to do something like that. But the big issue, or a big issue, is the fact that you don't know how long the bad actors were into your system. So you may be backing up stuff that is already compromised and don't even know it. And even though you're very good about it, you check your recovery, you do everything, you just don't know because it's one issue is how much time do you need, how much data can you afford to lose, which is kind of sets that time, which is what I was always thinking about. my mind had gone to, like, in control systems, it's common to have a hot backup on critical operations. And so you could almost say, well, I'm going to double write everything and do something to try to protect that from being compromised in some way or something like that. But the issue I think that you raised, I found very interesting there is, but they may have been in your system for weeks and you don't know it. And so even though you did a very good job of backing up, it's not just the data you lost when you actually lost it. It's what you saved before you lost it. And there's no way to know what that is, right? I guess.
And the threat actors are looking at that, your strategy. They're going to try and figure out what your backup strategy is, because the ransomware, what it's really doing is it's covering their trail. Because if they hit you at the right time, if you restore from backup, everything that they did between that backup and when they detonated is now lost to you. There's no way to forensically recover that, And so they could have done all kinds of really bad things to your system. They could have changed, the way that your system operates or like that. How do you know? So now, you could restore from backup, but how are you going to go through and do all your validation checks? How are you going to go through and check the integrity of the system before you bring it back online? Too many organizations, especially on the industrial control system side, they just said, "Oh, we'll restore from backup, be right back up and operational." Like, whoa, are you certain about that? Is somebody going to give the okay to flip that switch when you haven't validated every single check along that line to make sure that everything's there, that everything's going to spin up the way that it's supposed to, and you're not going to fry your system, you're not going to do something harmful, cause a kinetic effect, because you're just trusting that your backups were actually, right, that they didn't change what was going on before you backed up, or between the backup and then. So,
Doesn't this also have implications for the fundamental questions about how you store your information? I'm thinking of things like journaling of data, maybe something a la blockchain, right, where every change is journaled. Now, to restore, you may have to replay the whole journal. Of course, the journal can be compromised as well, but that's, and of course that means fundamentally redesigning how your data is managed. And I don't know that, I do know that that's not a trivial exercise, but I think it's how the data is used, how it's managed, how it's stored, and to Clint's point, you have to tailor your design, your backup and recovery design, to factor in all of those issues.
So I had one question around the same topic. So with the, have you seen where people or industries, other end users out there are starting to take advantage of different ways of backing up? So you've got your easy backups, which are your images and stuff. Do they take advantage of database backups? Do they take advantage of other types of backups so that aren't as easy to come back from, but may not be as vulnerable as your image backups?
I don't have any specific examples. Does anyone?
yeah, I can say that I have seen over the last 3 years, ever since ransomware has really started to catch on and become the norm, I guess over the last 5 years, is organizations are starting to take a step back and look at how they're backing up. Their backup strategy is, I can say that most organizations I go into, the first thing, when I'm doing assessments with them, the first thing they'll say is, our backup strategy is currently under redevelopment. We're re-architecting the way that we back up. And most of these are places that got hit with ransomware. That's why they called us in the first place, is because they realized how much their backup strategy helped them from a day-to-day steady state operations, but they weren't helping them in times of crisis. They weren't exercising their backup strategy as part of a disaster recovery plan. They didn't understand that they were backing up parts of the data, but not the system as a whole. So they could recover the data from the backup, but they couldn't recover the entire system from the backup. And so that's what they had to look at, is how do we do this? How do we have offline backups, online backups, redundant backups? How are we doing all this? And can we afford to do it across the entire enterprise, or do we have to pick and choose how and where we do it? And then that's one of the most fun questions you can have as a cybersecurity person, is to say, what's the most critical thing that we do in an organization? And then watch the infighting happen. That's popcorn time for me. I'm going to sit back and say, you guys figure that out.
I don't want to. I'm sorry if somebody else wants to ask a question. I don't want to dominate, but is there a best practice for backups? I guess that's my question.
I think
Do them. So part of our Vader assessment that you can get will help assess your backup strategy, especially around industrial control systems. But that's the thing is, if you go out and look at some of the resources we have online, especially if you use like the self-evaluation toolkit, the backup strategy, the backup templates, there's 16 sectors of critical infrastructure. There's probably over 50 or 60 different backup strategies depending on what you do, how you do it, and how often you need it. Some companies, if you don't change your model very often, if you're not, doing new things, then your backup strategy doesn't need to be that complex. But other organizations like, the financial industry, their backups, I mean, when you're talking about day trading and, anything like that, their backups have to be airtight, hold up forensically in a court of law kind of thing. And that's what you need to look at. From a regulation standpoint, what do you have to recover from your backups, or what would you prove to a regulator if your main, systems got hit, you're recovering from backup, could you still pass a regulatory audit? That sort of thing. Every environment's going to be different. You have to being in a lot of different people, your operations team, your risk management team, your regulation team, and you're all going to have to sit down and have a really hard conversation. What do we need? How do we need it? I highly suggest you bring the FBI in that, because what they're going to need to prosecute is going to be completely different too. And then how long you can keep those, and how long they're good for. The recovery point objective, I can't stress that enough, is just as important as the recovery time objective.
Hi, Steve Royston from ABB. This may be a little bit tangential, but I was wondering what, if anything, government organizations are doing to, if you like, disable the ability to collect the ransom. In other words, maybe mechanisms to red ink the cryptocurrency that may, in other words, rendering it impossible to actually collect a ransom using ransomware. Could you enlighten me on that? Pardon my ignorance, but it's just making it impossible for someone to collect a ransom using cryptocurrency, for example. Is it what's being done in that area?
Well, with the Colonial Pipeline, I think that they were able to recover a huge portion of the ransom that they paid. I wish that's really the FBI's, more the FBI's, but I'll try and speak to what I know about that is they follow those wallets very closely. The problem with cryptocurrency is because you can break it apart, you can sell off share parts of it, you can move the wallets around, and that's the problem. It's like money laundering, but it's a shell game. They keep moving those wallets around, and the FBI and the Secret Service, they have their eyes on all those wallets. But the more times they trade hands, you start to say, okay, now is this a legitimate withdrawal? Yeah, the money was stolen at one point, but it's now passed so many different hands. How do you, it's not that we don't know who took the money out. It's, could you prosecute that person without a shadow of a doubt that they were involved with any of the undertakings? It's linking it all back. And that's why we always tell people, if you have a cyber incident, even if you don't want to prosecute or you don't need FBI's help, bring them in so that they can start to build a case so that when they do see these wallets get taken, the money withdrawn from these wallets or sold off or something like that, they can say, we know without a shadow of a doubt, because we have too many people pointing their finger at that person, that's really the person that we need to go after. And that the countries are willing to extradite based on that information. Because that's the problem, is that we have all this information, but we give it to another country and they look at it and say, this isn't enough to extradite. You're not really showing me that this was the person that did all of this. And so we really have to play that game. We have to sit and watch and wait. We have to gather intelligence, but the intelligence comes from you. Once again, it's us collecting your log files, or you giving us your log files that you're willing to give us, so that we can build a case against them, so that we can bring more of these people to justice. But also a lot of them are in non-extradition countries. So then we have to wait for them to get, a significant other who wants to travel, and then we snag them at the airport. So
Think of the analogy of counterfeit money, right? Just because somebody passes a bad 50 doesn't make them guilty. Just means that they received it somewhere along the way. And you may not be able to trace it back to the person that actually is printing it in his basement. That's a simple analogy, but I think it makes a lot of sense.
that was really the design of cryptocurrency, was to be untraceable, to give you some anonymity. And so it's really hard, but the FBI guys are really good at that. The Secret Service just as well, is they can track that stuff, and they're keeping an eye on those people. It's just, do we have enough to bring it home?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was really interested in that because, like I said, this is Clint's personal opinion. was I think that Colonial, because they actually restored everything from backup. They didn't actually use the decryption key. It was too slow. I think that they paid the money more to keep that data from going public. And so I was really wondering if once they got the money back from those guys, whether they were going to release the data as kind of a, hey, if you take your money back from our crypto wallet, we're going to release your data because you didn't follow through on your end. But from what I understand, nothing's been released publicly. So, but yep. Yeah, they're really, the FBI, I think, is getting really good at that. Just like with, business email compromise, if you can notify them within 24 hours, or if they're part of the whole process of you paying the ransom, there's a good chance, that they might be able to do something. I'm not saying they could be able to recover something, but they'll be able to at least link it to a threat actor or find, hopefully, get that stuff back, so.
Okay, so it's 3:37, so we are out of time. Thank you very much, and thank you for the very subtle reminder back there doing that. And